The courthouse was unusually crowded for a weekday morning. Long before the gavel struck, every bench in the courtroom was filled. Journalists sat shoulder to shoulder, notepads ready, cameras discreetly balanced on their knees, despite the judge's warning about flash photography. The air buzzed with hushed conversations and the sound of shuffling papers. Everyone had come to witness what many were calling the trial of the year. At the center of the courtroom sat a man whose name had been splashed across every news headline for months. The defendant, a 30-something man accused of a violent home invasion that had left an entire neighborhood shaken. His expression was unreadable as he sat at the defense table, back straight, jaw tight, his eyes darting between the judge and the prosecutor. Some people in the gallery watched him with anger, others with curiosity, but no one with pity. What made this case so unusual was not just the crime itself, but who had helped solve it. Rex, a decorated police canine with a reputation for never losing a scent. Rex sat quietly near the prosecutor's table, his golden brown fur glistening under the overhead lights, his dark eyes scanning the room with the steady alertness of a soldier on duty. Though he lay still, there was something almost regal about his presence, as if he knew the part he had played in bringing the accused to this very moment. In the front row sat a young mother, her face pale, her hands tightly clutching the small figure beside her. A 3-year-old girl with big, curious eyes and a head of soft brown curls. She looked far too small for such a serious setting, her little legs swinging as they barely reached the edge of the bench. The girl was clutching a stuffed bunny with one hand and her mother's sleeve with the other. Some courtroom regulars exchanged puzzled glances when they saw the child. Witnesses were usually kept away from the stress of proceedings, especially one so young. No one knew that the girl had been present during the crime that brought them all here, or that her presence today had been quietly approved by the judge after a private conversation with the prosecutor. The little girl wasn't on the official witness list, but her mother had insisted she sit in the courtroom, believing she was finally ready to face what had happened. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. "All rise," he announced. Every person in the courtroom stood as the judge took his seat, surveying the room with a steady, experienced gaze. The heavy sound of the gavel echoed against the walls, silencing the last of the whispers. "Court is now in session," the judge said, his voice carrying an authority that made even the most casual observer sit up straighter. The prosecutor rose first, straightening his suit jacket before addressing the jury. He spoke with calm confidence, reviewing the facts they had heard over the last several days. The break-in, the terrifying hours the victims had spent hiding in a closet, the evidence collected at the scene. But when his hand gestured toward Rex, the room seemed to lean in a little closer. "This is Rex," he said, his tone softening for the first time. The K-9 who followed the trail that night and found the victims before it was too late. His work is why we are here today, and why the person responsible is sitting in this courtroom. All eyes turned to the German Shepherd. Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't move, his gaze fixed on the defendant. There was a weight in that stare that was impossible to ignore. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing briefly at the dog before looking away. The prosecutor didn't miss the movement, but he said nothing. The mother in the front row squeezed her daughter's hand, but the little girl's attention was fixed on Rex. She tilted her head as if she recognized him, which she did, though it had been many months since that night. To her, Rex was not just a dog. He was the one who had pushed open the closet door with his wet nose, the one who had wagged his tail to let her know she was safe. The child's small face was calm, but her wide eyes were alert, darting between Rex and the man sitting at the defense table. Something about the sight of them both in the same room was stirring something inside her that her mother didn't notice. Not yet. Across the room, the defense attorney stood to give his opening remarks, trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case. He spoke about circumstantial evidence, about the lack of eyewitnesses, about the possibility of mistaken identity. His voice was steady, but a few jurors looked skeptical. Too much evidence had been presented. Too much had lined up against his client for anyone to easily dismiss it. Still, he pressed on, raising doubts where he could. The little girl didn't understand most of the words being used, but she could feel the tension. Her small fingers dug into her mother's sleeve. She didn't like the way the man at the table kept glancing at her. The mother leaned down, whispering softly, "It's okay, baby. We're safe." But the little girl's eyes never left Rex. Something in the air shifted when the prosecutor brought out a photograph of the crime scene. It showed the closet door, half open, claw marks visible where Rex had scratched to get inside. The girl's grip on her bunny tightened. She remembered that sound, the scratching that had terrified her at first, until the door opened and Rex's face appeared. The prosecutor was still speaking when the little girl's small hand rose, almost on its own. No one noticed at first, not until she stood up on the bench. People near the front turned their heads, curious. And then in a voice just loud enough to carry across the hushed courtroom, she pointed at Rex and said the words that would change everything. The moment the little girl's small voice rang through the courtroom, the entire room seemed to freeze. Every eye turned toward her. The defense attorney stopped mid-sentence. The jurors shifted forward in their seats, suddenly alert. Even the court stenographer looked up from her keys. But Rex did not hesitate. The sound of her voice seemed to spark something in him. His ears shot up, his whole body alert, as though someone had just flipped a switch inside him. He stood, muscles tense, pale stiff, and let out a low, rumbling growl that echoed in the otherwise silent room. The handler immediately tightened the leash. "Easy, Rex," he murmured, but the dog wasn't taking his eyes off the defendant. The growl deepened, vibrating through his chest. The little girl's mother's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. She gently tugged at her daughter's arm, trying to sit her down again. "Sweetheart, you can't just..." But the judge raised a hand. "Let her be." His voice was calm, curious. The prosecutor looked from the girl to Rex, then to the jury. His instincts told him this was no ordinary moment. He stepped toward the bench where the girl stood, crouching, so he was eye level with her. "What do you see, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his voice gentle so as not to frighten her. The girl didn't answer right away. Her little chest rose and fell quickly, her small hands gripping the back of the bench as though it anchored her to the world. Then, slowly, she lifted her tiny finger and pointed, not at Rex this time, but straight at the defendant. "Bad man," she said, the words clear, certain, and somehow chilling in their simplicity. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The defendant's head snapped toward her, eyes wide. For a split second, a flash of anger crossed his face before he masked it with a sneer. But that one instant was enough. Enough for Rex to lunge forward, barking sharply, his leash pulling taut. The handler had to use both hands to restrain him. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order in the court." The sound startled the girl, and she quickly sat down again, pressing herself against her mother's side. Her mother wrapped an arm around her, her own face pale with shock. She hadn't prepared for this. She had thought her daughter would just quietly observe, maybe hold her bunny and draw comfort from seeing Rex again. She hadn't expected her child to speak. The prosecutor's mind raced. He had reviewed the psychologist's report before the trial. The girl was considered too young to testify. But what she had just done wasn't testimony in the formal sense. It was an unprompted, instinctive response. And the jury had heard it. The defense attorney was already on his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly improper. The child is not on the witness list, and this is prejudicial." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Sit down, counselor. The court will address this." Rex, meanwhile, had not calmed. He stood rigid, chest heaving, his gaze locked on the defendant as if daring him to move. The handler knelt beside him, speaking softly, trying to soothe him. But it was clear, Rex sensed something that no human could. The jurors watched in stunned silence. Some of them looked shaken, others intrigued. The judge turned back to the prosecutor. "Do you believe this child's outburst is relevant to the case?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied without hesitation. "I believe this could be crucial." The judge nodded once, then looked at the girl's mother. "Ma'am, would you and your daughter please step forward?" The mother hesitated, glancing down at her daughter, who clutched the bunny tighter but didn't protest. Together, they walked to the witness stand, the little girl's small shoes tapping softly on the tile floor. Rex followed them with his eyes, his growl subsiding into a low, steady rumble, but his attention never leaving the defendant. When they reached the front, the bailiff gently swore in the mother, who sat on the witness chair, her daughter on her lap. The judge leaned forward slightly, softening his usually stern expression. "Little one," he said gently, "can you tell us why you said that?" The girl looked from the judge to the prosecutor, then back to Rex. Her voice was small but steady. "Because he's the bad man." She pointed again at the defendant without hesitation. The room went so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. The defense attorney jumped up again, shouting, "This is outrageous. She's a toddler. She doesn't know what she's saying." But it was too late. The words were already hanging in the air, and everyone had heard them. One of the jurors, a woman in her 60s, pressed a hand to her chest, visibly moved. Another juror glanced at his peers, his brows furrowed, as though piecing together the puzzle. The prosecutor seized the moment. "Do you know who helped you, sweetheart?" he asked, nodding toward Rex. The little girl's eyes brightened. She nodded, then pointed at Rex. "Doggy found us." "He was brave." The prosecutor smiled gently. "Do you remember what happened that night?" The girl's mother looked alarmed. This wasn't part of the plan, but the girl answered anyway. "We hid in the closet." Mommy cried. The bad man was loud. Then Doggy came. A reporter in the gallery scribbled furiously, sensing this was about to become front-page news. The defendant, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenching. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, boring into him. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Rex gave a short, sharp bark. A sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet courtroom, making the defendant flinch. The judge rapped his gavel again, but did not reprimand the dog. Instead, he looked at the defense attorney. "Counselor, I will allow this line of questioning. Your objections are noted for the record." The defense attorney sat down hard, his face tight with frustration. The prosecutor turned back to the jury, his voice steady, confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a lot of evidence over the past few days. You've seen photographs, heard expert testimony, and examined every detail of this case. But sometimes," he said, gesturing gently toward the little girl, "truth is not complicated. Sometimes it is as simple as 2 words. He paused, letting the moment sink in. The little girl, unaware of the gravity of her statement, rested her head against her mother's shoulder, her thumb in her mouth now. She looked small again, like just any other toddler. But the damage, or rather, the truth, had been done. Rex finally lay down again, his head on his paws, but his eyes stayed locked on the man at the defense table, as if daring him to deny it. And for the first time since the trial had begun, the defendant did not meet anyone's eyes. The silence that followed the child's words was heavy, almost unbearable. It felt as if the entire room had stopped breathing. Then, almost imperceptibly, the energy changed. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, like a wave crashing through a crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, some of them exchanging wide-eyed glances. Jurors leaned forward, their faces tight with focus. The little girl had just spoken two of the most powerful words anyone could have imagined, and they had pierced through the courtroom like a blade. Bad man, the judge, normally stoic, looked down at the child with an expression that was part curiosity, part gravity. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but he knew the weight of moments like these. They could change everything. Order. The judge barked, slamming the gavel once. The murmurs subsided, though the tension remained thick enough to touch. The defendant shifted in his chair, his lips pressed in a thin line. His knuckles were white, where they gripped the edge of the table. The calm, collected mask he had worn for the entire trial seemed to crack slightly. Rex's handler kept one hand on the canine's harness, but Rex was still visibly agitated, his body coiled like a spring. His dark eyes never left the man in the defendant's chair, as though he sensed something the rest of them couldn't see. The prosecutor, seizing the silence, crouched slightly to look at the girl. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "do you remember what happened the night you saw the bad man?" The girl nodded, her curls bouncing slightly. "He came at our house." Mommy cried. Her little voice trembled now, but she went on. "We hid in the closet. It was dark." Her mother's arms tightened around her, but she didn't stop her. Tears shone in the woman's eyes as she watched her daughter recount the memory she had worked so hard to protect her from. The prosecutor glanced at the jury. Some of them were visibly moved. One juror had tears in her eyes. "Can you tell me who found you?" The prosecutor asked gently. The girl's face softened. She pointed to Rex. "Doggy. He came." At that, Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, as though acknowledging her words. A small ripple of emotion passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you are hearing right now is not rehearsed testimony. This is the spontaneous recollection of the victim, a 3-year-old child who remembers exactly who saved her and who hurt her." The defense attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection. This is prejudicial and highly unreliable. This child cannot be considered a competent witness." The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Objection is noted, but overruled," he said finally. "The jury may consider the weight of the statement for themselves." The defense attorney sat back down, muttering under his breath. The prosecutor turned back to the defendant, his voice suddenly sharper. "Would you like to say anything in response to what we've just heard?" The man's jaw tightened. He didn't speak at first, but his body language betrayed him. A muscle in his cheek twitched, his shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, it looked like he might explode. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. "You're really going to let a toddler decide this case?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "She doesn't even know what she's talking about." Rex barked sharply at the sound of his voice, lunging forward. The handler struggled to keep him restrained. The little girl gasped and pointed again, louder this time. "Bad man?" This time her words echoed through the courtroom like a hammer blow. The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. The judge pounded his gavel. "Order." The defendant slammed his hands on the table. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking. The outburst was a mistake. The jury turned to look at him, taking in the red flush of his face. The way he seemed to be losing control. The prosecutor's expression was calm, but inwardly, he knew this was the turning point he had been waiting for. A guilty man under pressure will always show his hand. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said firmly, "I believe this child has just provided the most honest piece of testimony this courtroom has heard. I request permission to call her mother to the stand immediately." The judge nodded. "Granted." Jury will remain seated. As the bailiff helped the mother and child settle into the witness stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. It was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning. The mother took a deep breath before the prosecutor asked his first question. Her voice was soft, shaking slightly. "That night," she said, "I was putting my daughter to bed when I heard the window break. He came in. I grabbed my child and we ran to the closet. We hid there for what felt like hours. I didn't think anyone would find us." She paused, tears filling her eyes. "And then Rex found us. I heard his paws, his breathing. He scratched at the door and barked. He saved us." Jurors hung on every word. The room was silent, except for the sound of her voice and the occasional click of a reporter's pen. The prosecutor nodded, letting the moment hang in the air before continuing. "And do you see the person who did this in this courtroom today?" The woman lifted her trembling hand and pointed directly at the defendant. "Yes," she said, her voice hard. "No. It was him." The defendant's composure broke. "You're lying," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. He surged to his feet, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like he might leap across the table. The bailiff was on him instantly, restraining him as Rex barked, snarling so loudly the sound echoed off the walls. Gasps filled the courtroom. The jurors stared, some of them wide-eyed, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The judge slammed his gavel so hard, the sound cracked like a gunshot. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt," he barked. The defendant sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, his shirt damp with sweat. The little girl, remarkably, did not cry. She simply stared at him, her small face calm, but her words still hanging in the air like a verdict of their own. "Bad man." The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice quiet but commanding. "Sometimes the truth isn't complicated. Sometimes it comes from the one person who has no reason to lie." The jurors looked back at him, their faces grim and thoughtful. The tide had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. And somewhere deep down, so did the defendant. The silence that followed the child's words was heavy, almost unbearable. It felt as if the entire room had stopped breathing. Then, almost imperceptibly, the energy changed. Murmurs rippled through the gallery, like a wave crashing through a crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously, some of them exchanging wide-eyed glances. Jurors leaned forward, their faces tight with focus. The little girl had just spoken two of the most powerful words anyone could have imagined, and they had pierced through the courtroom like a blade. "Bad man." The judge, normally stoic, looked down at the child with an expression that was part curiosity, part gravity. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but he knew the weight of moments like these. They could change everything. "Order." The judge barked, slamming the gavel once. The murmurs subsided, though the tension remained thick enough to touch. The defendant shifted in his chair, his lips pressed in a thin line. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table. The calm, collected mask he had worn for the entire trial seemed to crack slightly. Rex's handler kept one hand on the canine's harness, but Rex was still visibly agitated, his body coiled like a spring. His dark eyes never left the man in the defendant's chair, as though he sensed something the rest of them couldn't see. The prosecutor, seizing the silence, crouched slightly to look at the girl. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "do you remember what happened the night you saw the bad man?" The girl nodded, her curls bouncing slightly. "He came at our house." Mommy cried. Her little voice trembled now, but she went on. "We hid in the closet. It was dark." Her mother's arms tightened around her, but she didn't stop her. Tears shone in the woman's eyes as she watched her daughter recount the memory she had worked so hard to protect her from. The prosecutor glanced at the jury. Some of them were visibly moved. One juror had tears in her eyes. "Can you tell me who found you?" The prosecutor asked gently. The girl's face softened. She pointed to Rex. "Doggy. He came." At that, Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, as though acknowledging her words. A small ripple of emotion passed through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, turning to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you are hearing right now is not rehearsed testimony. This is the spontaneous recollection of the victim, a 3-year-old child who remembers exactly who saved her and who hurt her. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. Objection. This is prejudicial and highly unreliable. This child cannot be considered a competent witness. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable. Objection is noted, but overruled, he said finally. The jury may consider the weight of the statement for themselves. The defense attorney sat back down, muttering under his breath. The prosecutor turned back to the defendant, his voice suddenly sharper. Would you like to say anything in response to what we've just heard? The man's jaw tightened. He didn't speak at first, but his body language betrayed him. A muscle in his cheek twitched, his shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, it looked like he might explode. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. You're really going to let a toddler decide this case? He said, his voice dripping with contempt. She doesn't even know what she's talking about. Rex barked sharply at the sound of his voice, lunging forward. The handler struggled to keep him restrained. The little girl gasped and pointed again, louder this time. Bad man? This time her words echoed through the courtroom like a hammer blow. The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. The judge pounded his gavel. Order. The defendant slammed his hands on the table. This is ridiculous, he shouted, his voice cracking. The outburst was a mistake. The jury turned to look at him, taking in the red flush of his face. The way he seemed to be losing control. The prosecutor's expression was calm, but inwardly, he knew this was the turning point he had been waiting for. A guilty man under pressure will always show his hand. Your Honor, the prosecutor said firmly, I believe this child has just provided the most honest piece of testimony this courtroom has heard. I request permission to call her mother to the stand immediately. The judge nodded. Granted. Jury will remain seated. As the bailiff helped the mother and child settle into the witness stand, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. It was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning. The mother took a deep breath before the prosecutor asked his first question. Her voice was soft, shaking slightly. That night, she said, I was putting my daughter to bed when I heard the window break. He came in. I grabbed my child and we ran to the closet. We hid there for what felt like hours. I didn't think anyone would find us. She paused, tears filling her eyes. And then Rex found us. I heard his pause, his breathing. He scratched at the door and barked. He saved us. Jurors hung on every word. The room was silent, except for the sound of her voice and the occasional click of a reporter's pen. The prosecutor nodded, letting the moment hang in the air before continuing. And do you see the person who did this in this courtroom today? The woman lifted her trembling hand and pointed directly at the defendant. Yes, she said, her voice hard now. It was him. The defendant's composure broke. You're lying, he shouted, his face contorted with rage. He surged to his feet, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed like he might leap across the table. The bailiff was on him instantly, restraining him as Rex barked, snarling so loudly the sound echoed off the walls. Gasps filled the courtroom. The jurors stared, some of them wide-eyed, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The judge slammed his gavel so hard, the sound cracked like a gunshot. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. He barked. The defendant sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, his shirt damp with sweat. The little girl, remarkably, did not cry. She simply stared at him, her small face calm, but her words still hanging in the air like a verdict of their own. Bad man. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice quiet but commanding. Sometimes the truth isn't complicated. Sometimes it comes from the one person who has no reason to lie. The jurors looked back at him, their faces grim and thoughtful. The tide had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. And somewhere deep down, so did the defendant. The courtroom was so quiet, it was as if time had stopped. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the creak of a juror's chair, the slow scratching of the stenographer's keys, every sound felt magnified. The mother sat in the witness stand, her daughter on her lap, both of them framed by the bright lights overhead. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the armrest tightly. It was one thing to tell her story in the safety of a police station. It was another to relive it here, with the man who had terrorized them sitting only feet away. The prosecutor approached carefully, his voice softer now. "Ma'am, please take your time. Can you walk the jury through what happened after Rex found you?" She nodded, her breath shaky. "I heard his nails scratching at the door," she said, her voice catching. "At first, I thought it was him, the man. I held my daughter so tightly, I was afraid I'd hurt her. And then I heard a bark, and I knew. It wasn't the bad man. It was help." The jurors leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. "I opened the door and Rex was there," she continued, her tears now spilling freely. "I'd never been so relieved in my life. He didn't just stand there. He pushed into the closet, sniffing my daughter, licking her face. And then he barked, loud, like he was calling someone. Seconds later, officers were there. They got us out. The courtroom was utterly still. Prosecutor let her words hang in the air before asking his next question. "And what did you see after that?" The woman's expression hardened. "They caught him. The man who broke in. He was hiding near the back of the house. He tried to run, but Rex chased him down." At this, Rex lifted his head proudly, as if he understood. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "This canine not only saved 2 lives that night, but brought the man responsible to justice." The defense attorney was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is highly emotional language meant to prejudice the jury." The judge gave him a measured look. "The witness is recounting facts. Counselor." Overruled. The mother's grip tightened around her daughter as the prosecutor moved closer. "Can you tell us," he asked gently, "what impact that night has had on you and your child?" She hesitated, then exhaled. "We don't sleep through the night." "Not really." "Any loud noise, and she cries. I can't let her out of my sight. We had to move out of that house. Every shadow feels like him." Her voice cracked. "She was 2 years old, and she still wakes up screaming sometimes. She calls for Rex in her sleep." The juror's expression softened, some nodding sadly. "And yet," the prosecutor said quietly, "she remembered him today. She remembered what happened, and who did it." The woman nodded, brushing tears from her face. "Yes, and she's right. That man is the reason my little girl is afraid of the dark." All eyes turned to the defendant. He sat stone-faced, but his jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. His attorney whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. The prosecutor stepped back, letting the weight of the mother's words settle over the room before he spoke again. No further questions. The judge turned to the defense attorney. "Cross-examination?" The defense attorney stood reluctantly, buttoning his jacket. He approached the stand slowly, attempting a polite tone. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "is it possible your memory of that night has become blurry? Traumatic events can play tricks on the mind. Perhaps you've convinced yourself this man was the intruder because the police told you he was." Her eyes narrowed. "No," she said firmly. "I know his face. I saw him that night when the closet door opened a crack. I saw him looking for us. That face," she turned and pointed directly at the defendant, "is burned into my memory." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The defense attorney hesitated, clearly rattled. He tried again. "And your daughter? She was only 2. Children that young are easily influenced. How can you be sure she remembers the truth and not what you've told her?" The mother's expression hardened. "Because I never told her what happened. I thought I was protecting her by not talking about it. Until today, I didn't think she remembered at all," the attorney faltered. The jurors watched him, unimpressed. His attempt to discredit the witness was falling flat. He cleared his throat. "No further questions," he said finally, retreating to his seat. The judge nodded. "You may step down." As the mother and child returned to their seats, the little girl glanced back at Rex, who wagged his tail slowly. She gave him a small smile, the first one anyone had seen from her all day. The prosecutor seized the moment, standing tall before the jury. "What you've just witnessed," he said, "wasn't a rehearsed statement. It was the truth. This mother and her child had no reason to lie. Their lives were torn apart by the man sitting at that table. And when confronted with his presence, this child, who we were told was too young to remember, identified him without hesitation." The jurors exchanged glances, some of them nodding. The shift in the room was unmistakable. A case no longer felt like dry facts and evidence. It had a human face now, too, actually, and a dog that had become the symbol of hope. The judge called a brief recess, and the courtroom erupted into whispers as people stood and stretched. Reporters rushed for the doors to file breaking updates. The defendant sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him. His attorney leaned close, whispering urgently, but the man didn't respond. His bravado from earlier seemed to have evaporated, replaced by something darker: fear. Rex sat quietly now, his job for the moment done, but his eyes never left the man he had hunted down once before. When court reconvened, the air felt different, charged, heavier. Everyone knew they were heading into the most crucial phase of the trial. The child's memory had rekindled something more powerful than anyone had expected. The jury had seen the fear, the tears, the courage. And now there was no turning back. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed like a hive. Word of the previous day's drama had reached every corner of the city. The toddler's words, Rex's growl, and the defendant's furious outburst were all over the news. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps. Inside, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The defendant entered in a wrinkled shirt, his expression hollow. He kept his eyes down, refusing to look at the gallery, the jury, or the prosecution table. The mask of arrogance he had worn since day one was gone, replaced by something heavier, dread. The judge called the court to order. "Counsel, we will proceed with closing arguments today. But before we begin, the court will allow one additional statement from the witness, Mrs. Carter." A murmur swept the room. The mother rose, holding her daughter's hand. This time, she walked to the stand with her head high, no longer trembling. Rex watched her intently, his tail thumping once against the floor, as if in silent encouragement. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, and looked straight at the jury. "I didn't plan to speak again," she began, her voice steady. "But yesterday I realized something. I've been letting fear control me since that night. I've been hiding from this man, even after he was caught. But if my daughter can look him in the eye and call him what he is, then so can I." The jurors leaned forward. "My little girl is braver than I ever gave her credit for," she continued. "She remembered what I thought she had forgotten. She remembered who hurt us and who saved us. And if a 3-year-old can find the courage to tell the truth, then I have no excuse not to do the same." Her voice broke then, but she didn't stop. "This man broke into our home. He terrorized us. He would have done worse if Rex hadn't found us in time. I need you to understand that this isn't just about a burglary charge or a piece of stolen property. This is about the night my daughter stopped feeling safe in her own bed. She looked at the defendant finally, her gaze cold and unflinching. You took something from us that night, and I'm here today to take it back. A hush fell over the courtroom so complete that even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment. Judge nodded gravely. Thank you, Mrs. Carter. You may step down. As she returned to her seat, she passed Rex, who reached his nose out toward her daughter. The little girl giggled softly and patted his head, the smallest smile breaking through her serious face. The prosecutor rose next, buttoning his jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began. What you just heard was not just testimony. It was truth. It was courage. And it was justice speaking through the voice of a mother who has lived every parent's worst nightmare. He paced slowly in front of them, his words deliberate. This case has never been about just one night. It has been about the ripple effect of fear, how one man's choice changed the lives of two innocent people. You saw his reaction yesterday. You saw how quickly his mask slipped when confronted with what he did. That was not the reaction of an innocent man. The jurors watched him intently. You've heard the evidence. You've seen the photographs of the house. You've listened to the officers, the neighbors, the experts. And then you saw something none of us expected. A child, too young to be rehearsed, too young to lie, point to the man who hurt her and call him exactly what he is. 2 words. Bad man. He let the words hang in the air. Sometimes justice is complicated. But sometimes it's as simple as that. He gestured toward Rex, who sat quietly at his handler's side. And let us not forget this K9. The reason this family is alive today. The reason we are even here. He remembered the man he caught that night. You saw it with your own eyes. The prosecutor turned back to the jury, his tone firm but measured. This is your moment. Your chance to say that what happened to this mother and child was not acceptable. Your chance to hold this man accountable. Don't let fear, his or theirs, control the outcome. Deliver justice. He returned to his table, leaving the room in heavy silence. The defense attorney stood next, his face pale. He tried to sound confident, but his voice lacked the force it had at the start of the trial. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to separate emotion from evidence, he said. My client has a right to be presumed innocent. A dog's behavior, a child's memory. These are powerful images, but they are not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. He gestured toward the defendant, whose head remained bowed. Do not let yesterday's outburst sway you. Stress can make anyone react in ways they regret. Do not let the state use emotion to replace facts. But it was clear he was losing them. The jurors' faces were unreadable, but there was no nodding this time, no sympathetic glances. When he finished, the judge gave final instructions to the jury. Then they were led out to deliberate. The room exhaled collectively. The gallery erupted into hushed conversation. Reporters scribbled furiously, phones buzzing as news outlets prepared breaking updates. The mother sat down, holding her daughter close. The little girl rested her head against her chest, eyelids drooping. It had been a long trial for someone so small. Rex stretched out beside his handler, calm now, but alert. His job wasn't done yet. He seemed to know the most important moment was still ahead. The prosecutor glanced across the aisle at the defendant. The man looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped, his eyes distant. He wasn't shouting now. He wasn't smirking. He was just waiting, like everyone else, to see what 12 strangers would decide about his future. The wait began. Minutes turned into an hour. Then 2. The courthouse grew quieter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Finally, just before dusk, the bailiff stepped into the courtroom. The jury has reached a verdict. Every head turned. The mother's grip on her daughter tightened. The defendant straightened slightly, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Rex stood, ears pricked, tail still dot. It was time. The courtroom filled with a silence, so thick it felt like the air itself had weight. The bailiff's announcement had sucked the noise out of the room, leaving only the sound of shuffling feet as the jurors filed back in. All eyes were on them. Some of the jurors looked pale. Others seemed resolute, their jaws set as though they had made peace with the gravity of their decision. The mother's hand found her daughter's and held it tight. The little girl sat wide-eyed, as if she could sense the moment's importance. Rex stood perfectly still at his handler's side, ears up, eyes focused on the defendant. The judge cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreman, an older man with silver hair, stood. "We have, Your Honor. Please hand the verdict form to the bailiff." The bailiff carried the folded slip to the judge, who opened it, read it, and nodded gravely. He handed it back to the foreman. "You may read your verdict." The foreman's voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of finality. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words detonated in the courtroom like a THUNDERCL EP. Gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few cheers before the judge banged his gavel for silence. The prosecutor's shoulders sagged with relief. The mother let out a sob, covering her mouth with one hand, but it was Rex who moved first. The German shepherd barked once, a deep, sharp bark that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. It wasn't a warning bark, not this time. It was triumphant, almost celebratory. The tension that had hung over the courtroom for days seemed to break with that single sound. The little girl smiled for the first time since the trial began. "Rex!" she cried, reaching toward him. The judge's expression softened as he looked over the room. "Order," he said, but there was no anger in his tone now, only gravity. "Mr. Harlan, you have been found guilty of home invasion, assault, and unlawful confinement. You will be remanded into custody until sentencing." The defendant's face went red. "This isn't over," he shouted suddenly, rising to his feet. In an instant, Rex was alert again, his handler gripping the harness. The dog growled low, a sound that froze the defendant mid-step. The bailiffs moved in quickly, restraining him, but not before the jury saw the fear flash across his face. The man who had terrorized a mother and child was now visibly terrified himself. "Get him out of my courtroom," the judge ordered. The defendant was dragged toward the side door, still shouting, but his voice cracked halfway through. The gallery watched silently, knowing they had just seen the last of his defiance. When the door slammed shut, it was as if the entire room exhaled at once. The judge turned back to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court." As the jurors filed out, several of them glanced toward the mother and child. A few smiled gently, one woman even dabbing her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor approached the mother. "You were extraordinary," he said quietly. "Both of you?" She shook her head, tears still glistening. "It wasn't me," she said, looking down at her daughter. "It was her." And Rex, the prosecutor, smiled at the dog, who sat patiently, tail thumping against the floor as if he understood every word. The judge gathered his papers, pausing before leaving the bench. "I've presided over hundreds of cases," he said, "but I have rarely seen a moment as powerful as what we witnessed yesterday and today. This court thanks the K-9 unit for its service, and this young witness for her courage." The room applauded softly, an unusual but fitting gesture. Rex's handler bent down, unclipping the leash so the girl could approach. She walked slowly, her small shoes clicking against the wooden floor, then threw her arms around the dog's neck. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. You did it. The camera crews caught the moment. A tear-streaked child hugging the heroic German Shepherd in the very courtroom where justice had just been served. By the end of the day, that image would appear on every major news outlet in the country. As the gallery began to empty, the prosecutor stood near the door, watching the little girl leave hand in hand with her mother. For the first time since the trial began, they looked lighter, freer, and Rex? He sat quietly, watching them go, his job complete, for now. The prosecutor turned to the handler. Does he know? The handler smiled faintly. He knows. Trust me. He knows exactly what just happened. The courthouse steps were bathed in the soft gold of a late afternoon sun. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing, microphones raised, eager to capture every word. But for the mother and her daughter, the outside world seemed to move in slow motion. The trial was over. A man who had haunted their lives for nearly a year was gone. This time for good. The little girl clutched her mother's hand with one fist and held tightly to Rex's fur with the other as they descended the stairs. The big German Shepherd walked proudly, his head held high, almost regal. It was as if he knew the world was watching, and that he was the reason this family could finally breathe. Again, down at the bottom of the steps, the prosecutor caught up to them. Mrs. Carter, he said, if you'd like to make a statement, now would be the time. The press will want to hear from you. The woman hesitated. She had spent months hiding, avoiding cameras, trying to keep her daughter away from the public eye. But now, after everything, she realized she didn't have to hide anymore. She turned to face the crowd of reporters. Microphones were thrust forward. I don't have a long speech, she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. I just want to say thank you to the police who didn't give up, to the prosecutor who fought for us, and to this dog right here. Rex saved our lives. And today, he helped us get our lives back. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing every word. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. Can I say something too? Her mother crouched down and nodded. The toddler looked straight into one of the cameras and said clearly, Rex is my hero. The crowd melted. There was a collective awe from reporters, photographers, even a few police officers standing nearby. Rex wagged his tail as if acknowledging the praise. The prosecutor smiled. I think that's the headline right there, he said softly. After the cameras were gone and the crowd dispersed, the small group found a quiet bench near the courthouse lawn. The handler let Rex sit beside the little girl, who buried her face in his thick fur. For the first time in months, her mother's shoulders seemed to relax. It's over, she whispered, as if testing the words on her tongue. The prosecutor sat on the bench across from her, his briefcase resting at his feet. Justice doesn't erase what happened, he said gently, but it gives you a place to start again. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I thought this day would never come. I thought we'd always be looking over our shoulders. You won't have to anymore, the prosecutor said. Rex's handler smiled faintly. And if you ever do, you know who to call. He'd run through fire for you two. The little girl giggled and kissed Rex on the head. I know, she said. The handler gave Rex a pat, then looked at the mother. You know, he has a retirement coming up next year. Dogs like him only work so many years before we let them live the good life. If you ever wanted to adopt him, the woman's breath caught. You mean he could stay with us? Once he's officially retired, yes, the handler said. And something tells me he'd be very happy there. The little girl's face lit up. Please, Mommy? The mother laughed through her tears. We'll see, the handler grinned. I'll make sure you're first on the list. They sat together in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. The prosecutor finally stood, brushing off his suit. I have to get back to the office, but I just wanted to say that what you and your daughter did in that courtroom, that was bravery. Don't ever forget that. We couldn't have done it without you, the mother said quietly. He nodded once, then turned and headed down the path, leaving the family with their hero. As the shadows lengthened and the courthouse grew quiet, the mother took one last look at the building where everything had happened. It no longer looked like a place of fear. It looked like a place where she had taken her life back. The little girl yawned and leaned against Rex, who stayed perfectly still, guarding her even in this peaceful moment. Ready to go home? The mother asked softly. The little girl nodded sleepily. Together, they walked toward the parking lot, the three of them, mother, daughter, and dog, silhouetted against the setting sun. For the first time since that terrible night, the future didn't feel so heavy. And somewhere deep inside, the mother knew that this was more than just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of something new, a life where her daughter could sleep without nightmares, where she could laugh without fear, and where a loyal German shepherd would always be watching over them. Rex glanced back one last time at the courthouse steps, then turned forward, his tail wagging. His job here was done.